Hello, welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. And today we're going to be discussing democracy and human rights in Hong Kong. So I'm just going to introduce our moderator, Bill Emmett. So he is a writer and consultant who was the editor-in-chief of The Economist magazine from 1993 to 2006. And during that period, he became well known as an expert on Japan, not least because of his book, The Sun Also Sets, which correctly predicted that the Japanese economic boom of the late 1980s was unsustainable. He continues to write about Japan, among many other subjects. His latest book was Japan's Far More Female Future, which was published a few years ago in both Japanese and English. And as well as all that, he is chairman of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and he's also chairman of the Japan Society in the UK. So over to you, Bill.
Well, thank you very much, Jason, and I'm honored to be asked to moderate this very important discussion about political developments in Hong Kong, but particularly about the human rights issue that has been raised. One can, I would say, see what's happened in Hong Kong as a sort of sad chronicle of a death foretold, to borrow somebody else's novel title, but also it is a situation that raises questions, of course, about human rights in Hong Kong, about the prospect for public protest and public opinion in Hong Kong, but as well for the extraterritorial reach of Chinese law as China becomes a superpower that wishes to behave in an equivalent way to the behavior of the United States. So this claim to have extraterritorial influence through the legal system is also an increasing concern for many people. But we're going to have three fantastic speakers to guide us through this, are much more expert than I am. First of all, Nathan Law, a democracy for activists from Hong Kong, as that slide says, who is now in exile abroad. He is part of the umbrella movement and of the Demosisto movement that was ahead of that protest, along with Agnes Chow and Joshua Wong, two well-known names. He's wanted by the Hong Kong authorities under the national security law, and he's going to open with a first presentation about the political developments in Hong Kong. He will be followed by Professor Eva Pils, Professor of Law at King's College London, also, as that says, an affiliated scholar at the US Asia Law Institute of the New York University Law School and connected with the Center for Human Rights in Erlangen, Nuremberg. Prior to joining King's, it's worth pointing out, before 2014, she was in Hong Kong as an associate professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong Faculty of Law. Following those two main presentations, we will hear from Professor Masato Kamikubo as a discussant with a briefer presentation followed by his reaction to the two presentations. He is a professor at the Graduate School of Policy Science at Ritsumeikan University in Japan, and his UK experience was doing his PhD at the University of Warwick. And I'm sure he will very much look at the implications of what's going on in Hong Kong for Japan's own foreign policy and for the international community. But without further ado, I will move on to Nathan Law, invite him to give us his opening presentation. So over to you, Nathan.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. And also thank you so much, everyone, for attending this conference and also for Daiwa Foundation to organize it. It's indeed a sad story when we talk about the human rights and democracy in Hong Kong. And for me, I've been in the center of these political storm for the past decades. And looking back, it's definitely, there are lots of ups and downs, and there are lots of things that the world should pick up. And it is there's just not enough attention at the moment. I've left Hong Kong for more than 3.5 years. And in these 3.5 years, I've met incredible people, and more of the people, the people who are interested in Hong Kong and have connection to Hong Kong are much more than what I've expected. Some of them, even though they're British, They were born in Hong Kong, they grew up in Hong Kong, they went to school in Hong Kong, or they worked in Hong Kong. And I think the same applies to many Japanese, that they've visited Hong Kong, that they've worked in Hong Kong, they have families in Hong Kong. And it really shows that Hong Kong, even though it is a small city, but it has big impact and it's well connected to the world. And it has been an international financial center for years. And when we talk about Hong Kong, we used to think that it was so flamboyant, it was so energetic, it was so cosmopolitan. It was like beacon of a free society in Asia. It used to be praised one of the freest city in the region. So what happened to Hong Kong, and why Hong Kong for now, as we see, has grown to be a authoritarian police state where its rule of law has already gone, and the legal system is being seen as an extended weapon of the government, and political rights are all gone. This is a story about Hong Kong, but this is also a story about China. So in 1980s, when the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed in between the British government and the Chinese government, it was like a treaty that governs the handover of Hong Kong in 1997, when Hong Kong ends its more than 150 years colonial ruling under the British government, and the Chinese government will take over that. In 80s, 90s, there were a couple of immigration waves, which people immigrated from Hong Kong to Canada, to the US, to the UK, because there was just no trust in the Chinese Communist Party and its social system. So the idea of Hong Kong being handed back to the Chinese government and the Chinese authority was scary to the Hong Kong people in in 1980s, given this political and economic situation in mainland China. So well, given that, there was a set of new rules that were introduced to convince Hong Kong people that after 1997, everything would be all right. And that was one country, two system and basic law, which is the small constitution of Hong Kong. So in one country, two system, it basically says that even though Hong Kong is part of China, but it runs a separate system. And the idea that it runs a separate system gives confidence to people that it would remain strong rule of law. It would remain a kind of safe harbor feature and system, so that all the terrible things that would happen in mainland China in the system won't come to Hong Kong. And the idea that Hong Kong is different is the fundamental cornerstone of the one country, two system. So apart from that, in the whole process and in the basic law, it also says that the cornerstone of one country, two system is freedom, rule of law, and democracy. So we have to put that into context into the 80s and 90s, when Hong Kong was about to be transferred, its sovereignty is transferred back to mainland China, so that we will understand what happens afterwards. Because Hong Kong people were promised certain things, especially democracy, but it has never arrived, and it incurred a lot of problems afterwards. So fast forward, I remember I came to Hong Kong in 1999 when I was 6 after the hangover, and up until I graduated from high school, we were in kind of a honeymoon period where Hong Kong people, they were very they were developing their relationship with China. They were happy with the how the one country system has evolved. There were less protest, and the government was also quite lenient towards protest and all the demands from Hong Kong people. But after Xi Jinping took power in roughly 2012 and 2013, things went sour, because with the assumption of Xi Jinping's leadership and its ambition in mainland China, the system becomes much more centralized, and the Chinese Communist Party becomes much less lenient to the demands for power and accountability. So we also could see a coincidence of Hong Kong stepping into the era of resistance where there were hundreds of thousands of people went down to streets and protest. And that was when I stepped into the public limelight. In 2014, when Hong Kong was about when Hong Kong was undergoing a political consultation on the electoral process, that was the moment when Hong Kong people felt like Beijing should deliver what they have promised in the one country, two system and basic law, which Hong Kong would gradually accomplish democracy. So they wanted to have democracy in 2017, and they went to protest. I was one of the student leaders in the umbrella movement, even though the movement was not a success, but it laid down the seed of civil disobedience and resistance in Hong Kong's population. And then we progressed to 2016 when I was elected as the youngest legislator in Hong Kong history at the age of 23. We saw another wave of new energy and young people going into the system, inside the system, trying to also make their voice heard about democracy and human rights. And who would have thought that that was actually the last open election that Hong Kong had in terms of the Legislative Council election? Because afterwards, we have 2019 protest, we have 2019 district council election, and then Beijing clamped down once for all, and they had made up their minds that Hong Kong, there's no longer needed a separate system and the understanding of free society in Hong Kong. So when we kind of assess the trajectory of the change of Hong Kong, we saw Beijing trying to really convince Hong Kong people that Hong Kong would maintain autonomy and democracy after 1997. And then we saw a period of honeymoon time when Beijing sort of respecting Hong Kong people's willingness and their demands, and Hong Kong people continue to fight for freedom and democracy. And then we've come to a phase when Hong Kong people became impatient about Beijing not delivering their promises, and then they resist and protest. And then to the stage when Beijing centralized all power and decided to eradicate Hong Kong's free society. So what had happened was after the 2019 big protest, we saw more than a quarter of population in Hong Kong, more than 2 million people marching down to the streets, a lot of violent conflict, a lot of international attention, and a lot of different dynamics. The largest protest we've ever seen in Hong Kong history. Beijing decided that they would crack down Hong Kong because they no longer need Hong Kong to be an example of them progressing and catching up, quote unquote, the West. And I think that is also manifest in the change of the Communist Party's leadership and the ambition of Xi Jinping, which Xi Jinping doesn't feel like he has to convince the world China is moving towards democracy. He is very confident in their one-party dictatorship and the all-power centralizing political system, and they no longer need Hong Kong to be the kind of example that they would catch up the West liberal system and also democracy. So it turns out when they no longer need Hong Kong to be that example, Hong Kong's freedom and democracy is a risk. And then in a matter of months or in a matter of years, when Beijing rolled out the national security law and also recently the Article 23, which is the expansion of these national security law, Hong Kong civil society crumbled in just a glimpse. So I think that the story of Hong Kong is also a story of how Xi Jinping and how the Chinese Communist Party evolved. And as long as we don't have a mechanism to hold the Chinese government accountable for their human rights abuses, as long as they think that they can still maintain that kind of really authoritarian system and one-party state, as long as they don't convince the world that China needs to move forward, move towards a more progressive and liberal system, I don't think there is a possibility that Hong Kong's situation could change. So the situation of Hong Kong goes back to the situation of our global democracy, which is we've seen global democracy backsliding. We've seen that we don't have enough mechanism to hold these human rights perpetrators accountable. And this is a big cautionary tale that we all have to learn lessons from Hong Kong and to think together on how we can address these problems. I think in the future, we definitely have to keep an eye on Hong Kong's development. We've got more than 1,800 political prisoners, people they would get into jail because of expressing their opinion, and there is no elections left, and there is no freedom of speech left. So I think we should definitely pay attention to it and urge our governments also to pay attention to it and adopt relevant policies to address the situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathan, for that very, very eloquent history, both personal and political, of Hong Kong. And I think you're absolutely right that it's very much a story that needs to be kept in the public eye, because otherwise it can easily fall away. I would only observe a personal anecdote, which is that last year I was at a financial event with a senior person I shan't name from a Hong Kong financial authority, who actually said the rule of law is still independently operating in Hong Kong. And I did stand up and ask, well, how is it that everyone I used to know in Hong Kong is now in jail, if that is the case? And that is the sad fact. That number that Nathan cited for the number of people in jail, represents just many of the people who were pretty well known in Hong Kong 10, 20 years ago. So it is a sad story. Now let me hand on to Professor Eva Pils, who will no doubt look at it in a very analytical, broader context. Professor Pils.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Thank you to the Daiwa Foundation, and thanks for everyone for being here. And I would like to really start by saying that, of course, in complete contrast to our first fascinating speaker, I'm very largely a mere observer of developments in Hong Kong and also in China, in mainland China. For many years, I've been trying to understand the options for human rights advocacy in both places. And of course, also, I have come to admire the courage of those who have been standing up for human rights. And as we heard from Nathan just before, for democracy. And just to start with a comparison, because I would like to use my time at the beginning here to contextualize the Hong Kong trajectory by seeing it in comparison or in the context of the broader trajectory of the system in mainland China. Now, of course, one thing that we can look at is the similarities, and just to visualize that, it was in Hong Kong that in 2020, upon the national security law, which Nathan, of course, also mentioned, coming into effect, people started holding demonstrations in this curious way, holding up papers, but papers that were blank. And of course, we know what that communicates, don't we? And we could see in November 2022, see a repetition of that form of protest, the blank paper protest, taking place in numerous locations in mainland China. And the message being communicated, I think is quite clearly one of, on the one hand, protest, but on the other hand, also a kind of self-censorship in protest, because blank papers are safer than any kind of written message that could get you into trouble, except, of course, that in both places, even those so-called blank paper protests did get the demonstrators and protesters into different kinds of trouble. So there are analogies that are important and similar, and we can, in this instance, see protest in mainland China, as it were, copying a method that is adopted earlier on in Hong Kong. And yet, if we try to sort of compare the two systems' trajectories in based on sort of social science methodologies, then I think it is important also to see that there are important differences, and that if we look here at VDEM's, the think tank VDEM's index for the evolution of civil society, rule of law, and liberal democracy indicators from 1980 to now, in mainland China, you can see a pretty depressing flat line with some significant reduction of civil society spaces, which I have to say very much sort of coheres with my impression from having lived and researched in mainland China. And if we look by comparison to Hong Kong, I think that this interesting graph here perhaps tells us a number of things. Firstly, of course, and this was so well articulated and demonstrated by Nathan through his presentation, and indeed his own experience, we can see the dramatic downward shift of all indicators, but especially the civil society indicator in Hong Kong over what I think we can call Xi Jinping's new era. We can also see, and I think that this is not insignificant, that especially the rule of law index remains, especially compared with the mainland China situation, quite a bit higher. And I think that that I would like to take that as a reason to sort of ask ourselves in more detail how Hong Kong society, and in particular opportunities for civil society and human rights advocacy, have evolved. And to sort of adopt a frame, and broadly speaking, I would say that we can see in these graphs, but then also in the more detailed developments, something of a very unfortunate convergence, what my colleague, Professor Mike Davis, and one of his books has called Making Hong Kong China, a convergence towards a system that I would suggest we can think of a kind of dual state. And so what do I mean with that? Well, at least from the 1980s onwards, in the People's Republic of China, in mainland China, we can see that there's a kind of reform movement that means that the still existing, the continued one-party dictatorship, also called in accordance with a Maoist concept enshrined in the PRC constitution, a people's democratic dictatorship, is kind of complemented, but then also very dramatically challenged by principles that become sort of referenced as ruling the country in accordance with law, Yifa Zhiguo. And in mainland China, I would say that that this means that there is very much a continued role of coercion, of arbitrariness, of lawlessness that we can see in practices of incarceration, of systemic use of torture, and of course also in all the surveillance and censorship and opinion guidance and so on that are characteristic of the mainland Chinese system sort of throughout its existence up to now. But we can also see, and this is very important in so many ways, that those those practices, that dictatorship element of the PRC system is being challenged by human rights advocacy, by proponents of the rule of law in mainland China. And that's why I would say that we can certainly, with regard to mainland China, sort of adopt this framework, this idea of the dual state where law and lawlessness coexist, and where it is important to see how the importance of sort of the weight of legal rules that are introduced in mainland China from the 1980s onwards. But it's also important to see that there's a sort of continued force of arbitrariness, of lawlessness, of what perhaps we can call a kind of rule by fear, where the state is always able to essentially suspend any legal protections that it has provided to citizens. And it is, of course, especially when it is provoked and challenged, for instance, by human rights advocates, by advocates of legal political change, that it does suspend legal protections and persecutes and represses and becomes altogether very nasty. And if we compare that trajectory to what Hong Kong has experienced, and I will limit myself in some contrast to Nathan, who gave us a very important sort of overall introduction of the history to the existence essentially of the special administrative region. So from the creation of the one country, two systems onwards. I mean, broadly speaking, I think we can say that it is a system with strong rule of law. Just to recall the graph I just showed a moment ago, a strong civil society, very weak levels of democracy, but that has many institutional protections and legal and protections in the form of legal norms and international treaty commitments that allow Hong Kong to exist as a society where really civil society organizations play an enormous role, and they play a role in challenging power holders and power abusers within Hong Kong, but of course also a hugely important role for human rights advocates and civil society more broadly in mainland China. As our chair mentioned a while ago, I did indeed live in Hong Kong from 2007 to 2014. And it was such a fantastic era for engaging with both societies, the mainland one and the Hong Kong one. And Hong Kong was truly a basis academically in civil society terms and so on, and media terms for studying and engaging with, but also challenging power abusers and human rights abusers in mainland China. Even from the perspective of perhaps what you might call the establishment in both Hong Kong and mainland China, during those years, Hong Kong was sometimes really portrayed as a kind of model for a rule of law-based society that might also in due course emerge in China. And so here, sort of on the slide on the left-hand side, you can see an article that kind of uses this this phrase of the tail wagging the dog to kind of suggest that that idea that Hong Kong, that perhaps mainland China could in some respects model itself on the quite admirable degree of rule of law that was available at the time in Hong Kong. And if we then fast forward to New Era Hong Kong, and I will not sort of go into any detail on the kind of political evolution since 2014 that Nathan talked about so eloquently based on his own experience. I think that what I would suggest really is that we can see a kind of reversion of that of those trajectories. We can see increasingly, most dramatically in first instance, perhaps with the introduction, or I really should say the imposition by the central authorities of the Hong Kong National Security Law in July 2020, an attempt to import models of governance and ideas of how the legal political order should serve the power holders being introduced from mainland China into Hong Kong. And so I think that with the national security law, essentially, as I'm sure we're all aware, introduces new criminal offenses that, broadly speaking, in my interpretation, criminalize political dissent and advocacy. It also starts creating closer linkages with the institutions of mainland China law enforcement for the implementation of the national security law. And then, of course, most recently, the Article 23 legislation, an ordinance established sort of within Hong Kong's, from a democracy perspective, already severely dismantled and diminished legislative process within the Hong Kong legislative process. This new ordinance essentially introduces additional crimes, and it also further sort of continues a process of what I would say institutional corrosion, especially of the criminal justice process in Hong Kong, by, for instance, by allowing for the restriction of access to counsel, I should say, and indeed allowing for closed trials in certain cases. And just sort of taking a step back from sort of thinking about these developments of the law for a moment, I would say that when comparing to the situation that we had prior to the new era in Hong Kong's reform era, there is of course no doubt that there has been a kind of severe weakening of the rule of law and human rights advocacy and so on. And yet I found it remarkable in my last visit to Hong Kong last year that it was possible at the time to go and listen in on the so-called 47 trial, so a trial that involves national security law-based crimes. And it was possible indeed even to visit some old friends now detained, as we know, partly sort of awaiting trial, a criminal trial in Hong Kong. And those facts, to my mind, kind of really captured the way in which Hong Kong nowadays is a system, a legal system, a civil society under immense autocratic pressure. And yet, in some ways, some of its institutions persist functioning the way they did before this new era deterioration. And we could, I think, say that with, for instance, a new this new ordinance that facilitates closed trials, we can see how those spaces, those processes that are still reminiscent of Hong Kong's former era are now being sort of further undermined. So without wanting to take up too much time here, I would just say very quickly to sort of try and analyze some of the main developments up to now. Mainly, I think we have seen serious attacks on the rule of law in the criminal process, and we can envisage that this will be will continue and very possibly get worse. It is important, I think, to sort of appreciate that the deterioration of the rule of law occurs not only in the criminal process, but also in the context, for instance, of media repression, of broadly repressive governance of public institutions. And of course, as an academic, I cannot but think of all the pressure that has been brought to bear on universities over the past couple of years. Beyond those legal provisions and those legal processes, we can also see, I think, a kind of extra legal development of the chilling effect, the rule by fear elements that are being gradually introduced in Hong Kong society. It is not only the direct application, the direct implementation of the national security law, or indeed of the new Article 23 legislation, but also the chill, the frightening aspects of potentially being affected by the criminal process, the many threats that are sort of disseminated into Hong Kong society that explain why we've seen such a serious weakening of Hong Kong civil society, in particular, of course, all the human rights advocacy groups that used to be so vibrant that have now disbanded, the exodus of Hong Kongers, et cetera, not to mention the kind of repression or really elimination of democratic processes that Nathan also talked about very eloquently. But sort of beyond that, I think that if we sort of think about this dual state-based analysis, we can also see that Hong Kong becoming China, Hong Kong becoming more closely intertwined with mainland China governance methods, of course, also means that Hong Kong becomes a tool of global autocracy, the kind of autocracy with a global reach that China is in the process of creating. And here too, I would say that we can, on the one hand, see, and I think that, excuse me, this was mentioned earlier on, the laws that have been newly created kind of purport to have a reach and application beyond Hong Kong's and China's borders. But equally important, I think, we can see extra legal and sometimes illegal practices of what is referenced by the authorities as law enforcement, increasingly playing a role. And in that sense, again, a kind of dualism of legal methods and lawless methods to expand what I would characterize as a kind of autocratic power abuse. And all of this, I think, we can expect to be further strengthened as a trend by the Article 23 legislation, not least because it has so much, it sort of adds these substantive crimes related to foreign interference. And the analyses that I would sort of pick out here on this slide are correspondingly bleak. And you can see in different how in different ways different observers emphasize the sense that a liberal order, a rule of law based order, is in a process of a kind of slow car crash type collapse. I would say, perhaps as a kind of final observation, that I do broadly agree with all these other assessments, and perhaps we have to see that if there is a clearly envisaged endpoint for Hong Kong's trajectory, it is, if not to make Hong Kong sort of just another Chinese city, then at least to bring it under so much autocratic control that it is no longer a basis for challenges and advocacy against the mainland Chinese autocracy. And of course, there is a very clear sort of weakening of liberal institutions and practices in Hong Kong. I would still want to say that if we try to sort of understand the situation as it is right now, there are still so many resources for advocacy and challenges to the system available in Hong Kong, and that, of course, if autocracy is in the process of becoming a more transnational phenomenon, a more transnational practice, then so is human rights advocacy. And Nathan's work, the work of so many organizations in the UK and other countries outside of Hong Kong and China is, I think, really becoming increasingly significant for human rights advocacy with regard to Hong Kong, and of course also to mainland China. So thank you very much, and I really look forward to discussing this further. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Eva. That was terrific, and also, I think, very helpfully placed developments in Hong Kong in the context of how things have evolved in China itself. I certainly remember the time when, at least leaving to one side, to me, the fantasy of China moving towards a liberal democracy, a more realistic positive assessment was that public opinion was being used by the authorities in a kind of positive way, that even there was data published for the number of public protests happening each year in certain issues, particularly the environment. There was a sense that it's to some degree public opinion was seen as a relevant input into policy making. And what you've very eloquently explained is how that has been somewhat closed down. But I think in the questions we can explore really still what is the scope for protest about issues both in Hong Kong and in communist China. Let me to speed on towards the discussion, let me introduce Kamikubo Sensei and ask him for his response and his view from Tokyo. Kamikubo Sensei.
Again, I'm Masato Kamikubo from Ritsumeikan University in Japan. Thank you very much for having a great opportunity to participate in such a significant event. And so I'm very impressed Nathan and Eva's presentations. We clearly understand the history of Hong Kong and also the current situation. In particular, China introduced new national security ordinance, the more strict rule. So the maybe situation is very difficult, but I have to think about the democratization. Okay, my role is a discussant, but discussant role is basically to provide a comment and ask questions to the speaker. But before it, I'd like to talk about something. Firstly, I'd like to talk about the relationship between our student and Agnes Chow. who was once called goddess of Hong Kong democratization movement. Maybe she moved to the Canada. It's very big news in the last year. She moved to Canada and attend the universities. But before arrest, we have an exchange program with Agnes Chow. So I'd like to explain. Next, I'm going to tell the current situation of the university education in Japan related to the democratization movement in the world, and give my opinion about the future of democratization. And finally, I give the comment and opinion to the presenters. I share the document. Okay, firstly, I'd like to talk about the Agnes Chow, Miss Agnes Chow, and Japanese student. From 2015 to 2018, Kamikubo seminar in Ritsumeikan University, a student group visited Hong Kong and discussed with Agnes Chow. First time we met Agnes was September 2015, 1 year after the umbrella movement. In 2017, we visited the Hong Kong Legislative Council and political party called Demosisto, which was formed by Nathan and other young people. And so my student discussed with her about not only democratization movement, but also about several policy issues such as welfare, social security, real estate policies, very important in Hong Kong, and of course, the economies. And Agnes also came to Japan and gave a lecture to the student of the Kamikubo seminar in Ritsumeikan in December 23rd, 2016. And the TV camera came. TV Tokyo broadcasted a digest of the lectures on June 19, 2017. And also, it is important, I'd like to introduce Agnes' online debate with Kamikubo seminar student on January 17, 2020, just before Agnes arrested. After the protest against the extradition bill amendment, we attempt to invite Agnes to Japan, but she was banned from leaving the country. So alternatively, we hold an online debate with Agnes using Skype. Before online classes were conducted at the university due to the COVID-19 pandemic, my students tried to use the technology to protect Agnes' freedom of speech. You can watch the YouTube online debate on the YouTube channels. This is the URL. I'd like to introduce Agnes' main argument in the lecture and debates. It is very interesting. First argument, Hong Kong's election are like the AKB general election. Just as Akimoto Yasushi decided everything in AKB's general election, Chinese Communist Party decided everything in Hong Kong election. Agnes tried to explain Japanese student, there is no free election in Hong Kong. AKB48 is a Japanese female idol group produced by Akimoto Yasushi. AKB48 general election is an event where supporters vote to choose the most popular talent within the group. However, before the election, producer Akimoto, already decided the winner of the election. So this election is completely controlled by the Akimoto. It is similar to the, Agnes said, it is similar to the Hong Kong election. Hong Kong election is controlled by Chinese Communist parties. Second argument is very interesting. In Hong Kong, where there is no fair election, the use of violence to achieve democracy is justified, she said. Japanese youth who have grown up with democracy as a given since birth do not understand this situation. During the online debate, my student criticized Agnes, leading to heated discussion with Agnes. On the other hand, Agnes also once told us, I don't want to use violence either. Agnes was a college student who loved for Japanese pop culture and Japanese idol. Please see the pictures that she enjoys sightseeing in Kyoto and drinking in Osaka with my student. She's just a college student face. Anyway, so every time I was interviewed about Agnes by mass media, I appealed, please don't call her goddess. Certainly, while she served as spokesman for the democratization movement, someone other than Agnes, like Nathan, was leading the democratization movement. Agnes herself did not possess the political power. So I don't want. She is called goddess of democracy. After she arrested and released, she disappeared. However, we saw Agnes' post on the Instagram and the Japanese translation of her post on the Facebook page of the political organization Japan Hong Kong Democratic Alliance in December 2023. But I think that it was very painful to see her act as a symbol of democratization. I believe that she was ordinary female student with love for idol. So she does not need to bear the burden of democratization movement any longer. Next, I'd like to talk about the university education scene in Japan, the future of the democratization. Japan is experiencing the aging population with a shortage of young people. The government believes it has no choice but to accept talented individuals from overseas. So there are many students from China and Hong Kong who they express reluctance to return to their home countries. In Ritsumeikan University, there are approximately 2,000 Chinese students. There is an increase of number of Chinese students who intentionally extend the deadline for submitting the master thesis 3 times in order to postpone their return home. Also, there is a growing number of Chinese students who hope for employment in Japan after graduation. Of course, there are also Chinese students who are studying Japanese democracy with intention of contributing to make a better society in China. However, there's a clearly certain number of students who remain in Japan with a motive of not wanting to return to China. Why they do not want to go back to China? One of the reasons is the national intelligence law. National intelligence law required overseas students and residents under the instruction of the Ministry of State Security to cooperate with the Chinese Communist Party's intelligence activities. It mandates the collection of information such as cutting-edge technology from government, companies, and universities, and passing it on the government. If one refuses the government demand, their family in China may be threatened. We feel concerned that international students who come to Japan to study politics may try to have their professors' information on their ideological belief, family background, and detail of the private lives from morning to night, under instruction from Chinese authorities. However, Japanese government and politicians are keeping quiet about this problem. I think that many Chinese students seem refugees of democracy in a sense. What is important for us? We have to continue teaching democracy to student in front of us, regardless of nationality. We hope to continue doing everything possible in the future to reduce the number of suffering young people like Agnes as much as possible. But I'm not pessimistic about China's future. For about 20 years, many Chinese students have been studying abroad in Japan, USA, and UK, and the number of people who understand democracy is increasing. There's a possibility that more democratic leaders may emerge if there is a change in leadership. The important thing is to continue the steady effort to increase such individuals, and this includes education in Japan as well. We teach democracy to students in front of us and nurture talent. In conclusion, in short, we do not need a symbol of democracy. It is more important for all of us to fight for democracy in our respective field. Maybe the more grassroots activity to develop the democracy is maybe important. This is the finish of my talk. And so I'd like to ask the question to the two speakers as a discussant. Firstly, as I said, grassroots I'd like to ask a question to two speakers. Firstly, first question is, I said in the presentation, so grassroots activities. In my case, teaching democracy to Chinese students is very important to develop the democracy. On the other hand, maybe the government, asking the government to protect the democracy is very difficult for us. So I'd like to ask the two speakers, what do you think about the possibility of the grassroots activities to develop the democracies? In the university, of course, maybe the teaching democracy to Chinese students. Maybe I hope that many Chinese young people and many Chinese elite is understanding the democracy when he study in the overseas universities. So maybe if they have a power in the future, maybe the situation is maybe gradually change. I hope so. So what do you think about it? This is the first question. Second question is to the Nathan particularly. Our duty as advanced democratic countries like Japan and UK is to protect and support young democratic activists like you and Agnes who are abroad. However, there is not enough support system in Japan, unfortunately. So there are very few young activists coming to Japan. But UK and Canada, so many young people is move to. But also UK and Canada may be better situation than Japan. However, I think that there are several problems in China. So what do you think the problem in the advanced countries are? And so what do you think, what do you request to the advanced country like Japan, UK, Canada? I want to know. So, and third question is to the Professor Pils. Of course, I'm very impressed your presentation. So it's very interesting comparison and the China's law. And so China also introduced a new national security ordinance. But why China introduced such a more strict rule? Because formal rules, maybe for example, Joshua Wong is arrested, and Agnes was once arrested. Many young activists are arrested already. And so the democratic movement is almost all stopped. But the nations moved to the UK. So maybe the old law is already effective. I think so. However, why now new strict rule is necessary? I think that China is maybe some economic situation very bad. maybe the Xi Jinping's leadership is unstable, become unstable now. So maybe it is very difficult to control the grassroots movement of the democratization. I think so. One of the reasons why, so the introducing the new ordinance is not a good situation for China. Bad situation, rather bad situation. Maybe the China's control is very face difficulties. So I want to know your opinion about it. Why strict rule is necessary now? When the old rule is already functions, why more strict rule is necessary? It is my question. Thank you very much. My role as a discussant is finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Kamikubo Sensei, and we've got down the slides. Now let's that's been a very helpful view from the outside from Japan. I would suggest that we move first to responses by Nathan and Eva to Kamikubo-san's excellent questions, and then that will leave us with around 20 minutes for Q&A with the audience here in the webinar. So please indicate with a raised hand that you want to ask a question. Kamikubo Sensei has asked, 1, the possibilities for grassroots activities, especially universities. 2, what do you expect and request from advanced countries in support of like democracy activism and human rights? And 3rd, why, given the use of rule by fear has been pretty effective, why do you need then to bother putting new laws in place to further increase the existing fear? Nathan,
Right.
let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bill, and thank you so much for the question, Kamikubo-san. So first of all, I think in regards to the Chinese student one, I think it is crucial that we continue to engage and have dialogue with them. As we've seen in the white paper protest, which was a massive mobilization of overseas Chinese students against the draconian COVID-19 measure in mainland China, it had actually demonstrated how big the impact would be, and also how much of a liberal community the Chinese overseas students had. The problem is, as you said, they face enormous amount of pressure whenever they are identified. It is not only them, but their families in mainland China, they would get questioned. I've seen cases, so many of them, that whenever these overseas Chinese students who protested were identified, on the next day, their families called them saying that you should not do it. You should not go against the Chinese Communist Party, while the National Security Police in mainland China sitting beside them. So that kind of pressure is huge, and that leads to a lack of representation of Chinese overseas liberal students. So all that we can see is all those little pangs, as we say, which is a very hyper-nationalistic Chinese students that we have. But actually, there's still a community of liberal Chinese students overseas, and we should continue our dialogue with them. And I've seen many of them attended my talk in different universities while they were so afraid to be seen or to raise a question or etc. Because also this is one thing that I think liberal democracies should be aware of, which is the overwhelming surveillance activities of the Chinese Communist parties inside the campus, so that it suffocates academic freedom and also the ability of these Chinese students to stand out and to express themselves. So this is, if we're talking about what the liberal democracy should do, which definitely one of them is to blunt the influence of the Chinese authority of different authoritarian regime. It can start in the campus, where we have to make sure our campuses are a place for students to think freely, to speak freely, regardless of where they come from, their nationality. And the Chinese students is facing great threats like this.
Shall I continue with the? Oh, sorry.
Apologies, I needed to unmute. Thank you very much, Nathan. Over to you, Eva.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks so much. Thanks for the question. I think it's a really tremendously important question, and of course, I agree also that universities and academics have a special responsibility in a sort of global age of autocratization. And I would fully echo both sort of comments on the importance of engaging on norms of democracy, of human rights, and so on, and also Nathan's observations on transnational repression affecting, unfortunately, civil society here in the UK and liberal democracies, including on university campuses and in the classroom. That's very much, I'm sad to say, my experience as well. There's no question that students, especially from mainland China, but of course also students from Hong Kong, express themselves or show themselves worried about the potential consequences of engaging on certain topics, etc. And that does create a challenge. But you asked about the role of the grassroots of civil society on the one hand, and also of the state on the other hand. And I would say that in my personal view, it is important, especially when we think about universities, to facilitate universities' own response to this issue. And I personally would say that often classroom situations kind of can best be addressed by trying to continue with as normal and free classroom discussion as possible. And so I think maybe that's also what you were reflecting on, Professor Kamikubo, because I think that it just is important to take the arguments as they come and to facilitate discussion as best we can, even if we can sense that there are odd silences in the classroom and that people seem to be hesitating to speak up. And sometimes, of course, also the interventions that seem a little bit directed and are very much sort of in favor of the repressive system can make for really great teaching moments in the classroom. That's not to minimize the importance of addressing the issue, but personally, I would want to see universities adopt strong endorsements of freedom of speech, adopt mechanisms for confidential consultation and advice given to students who feel under pressure, while at the same time I'm really not in favor of the state sort of intervening in what universities and liberal democracies do to protect and uphold academic freedom and integrity. That means that conversely, I'm a bit hesitant about the role of the state in this context, and maybe that is also reflective of what you said, Professor Kamikubo. I would personally say that the state could do a lot more to honor its duties to protect everyone who comes here, for example, to the UK, in their exercise of their human rights, by essentially enabling and supporting people who experience threats from their governments, providing adequate protection of the criminal justice system eventually, but long before that, helping vulnerable communities, for instance, of immigrants, of people in exile, in terms of their immigration status and so on. And I think that the third question that was directed to me, should I sort of go straight to that, or are we going through the questions one by one? Yeah?
No, go straight ahead. Yep.
Okay. straight ahead. Great. Yeah, really great question. Why do we even need the Article 23 legislation when we've already got the NSL, and isn't that a kind of overkill? I mean, I guess that one part of the answer to that question has to be that autocracies like overkill, right? There's a certain logic of being very concerned with national security, and that leading to more and more repressive measures. And so I think that we see that at play to some extent. But I would also say, as I sort of hinted at perhaps in my presentation, while the introduction of the national security legislation did a lot to undermine the rule of law in Hong Kong, I think that it didn't completely destroy it. And we can still see a certain transparency of the legal process. We can see fairly robust, and admirable legal advocacy being used in national security law cases in Hong Kong. We can even see reporting under incredibly adverse circumstances, and academics, being courageous and wonderful. And so all of that, of course, from the perspective of the repressive central authorities, I think is unwelcome. And so I think that we can also understand the introduction of the national security the Article 23 basic law related new ordinance as essentially trying to sort of further undermine all of that by restricting institutional protections and legal protections, and by creating these further new crimes that will further intimidate anyone and sort of frighten them and thereby potentially stop them from speaking up. So I think that both of these sort of aspects are at play, and I think that ultimately, of course, we will have to see how this new legislation sort of impacts the system overall. But we are still coming back to the original slides that I showed a while ago. I would still insist that there is still a wide difference between the situation in Hong Kong and mainland China.
Very interesting. Thank you very, very much. And I think it is worth just adding as a writer two thoughts. One is that in terms of the situation of students abroad, while China is, of course, the latest and most important case because of the numbers of people involved, Chinese students abroad are not unique in this circumstance by any means. There are plenty of other nationalities of students coming from autocratic societies, both now and in the past, who have faced these issues, and that we have faced these issues. Eva, please.
Might I just interject, because I forgot to mention that, but really important point that you just made. Thank you, Bill. And I would add that I think it is incredibly important not to stigmatize any students or academics who come as visitors to our institutions. And we are at risk of doing that, even if we don't intend it. And so it's kind of extra important to try and be as open and inclusive as we can.
Absolutely. And second addition comment is that to some degree this Article 23 legislation and others, and the points that Eva makes about Hong Kong democracy, show that actually autocratic societies often do not want to appear as if they are brutally autocratic. And that tendency to try to make it seem as if everything is according to a written down law rather than arbitrary is something that activists can exploit. And work to use. So it's not all negative. Now I'm going to introduce.